This is Warren Vanderhill with the Center for Middletown Studies project on Muncie's faith communities. Today I'm speaking with the Reverend Dr. Wade Allen, the senior pastor at First Baptist Church in downtown Muncie. The date is January 19, 2017. Wade, I want to begin by thanking you for participating in our project. And I want to begin by asking you to tell me about your personal faith journey, how you came to become a pastor, how you got to Muncie, Indiana from someplace back there.
Yeah. Okay. I grew up in Georgia, so and went to college. While I was in college, sensed a call to ministry, so I knew that was something that I wanted to do. Ended up going back to Georgia, doing a year internship in a church after finishing my undergrad. And at that time, sensed that I wanted to come to seminary, or wanted to go to seminary. And I grew up Southern Baptist, and I had a fund in our church that would pay for my seminary as long as I went to a Southern Baptist seminary. Mm-hmm. So that was a real practical matter. And began to look at different Southern Baptist seminaries, and decided that Louisville would be the place I would go to seminary. And so in moving to Louisville, began to look around at different opportunities to serve in a church there, and was actually contacted by an American Baptist area minister on the other side of the river, and connected me with a church down in North Vernon, Indiana, and that's what brought me to the Midwest. So I served in that church, not knowing what an American Baptist church was, just being familiar with Southern Baptist life. But having served in that church, I really enjoyed the dynamics of American Baptist life, a much smaller denomination than Southern Baptist, a little different theologically, but it was a better fit for me. And so we decided to remain in American Baptist life. Went from North Vernon, Indiana, over to Springfield, Illinois, and served as an associate pastor in a church there for 9 years in downtown Springfield. And a church is very similar in many ways to First Baptist here in Muncie. Downtown, on the front steps of the church, sits the governor's mansion in Illinois, and out the back door of the church is the state capitol. So right in the middle of town. But in many ways, very similar to First Baptist in terms of its demographics and being an older mainline church. It would be the First Baptist Church in Springfield, although it's called Central Baptist Church. And then, having been in Springfield for 9 years, I really enjoyed it there, liked it there, thought that we would stay there. And then the church from Muncie contacted us. Initially, we told them we weren't really interested in moving, but they called the second time. And through a process, a fairly grueling process, to be honest, we sensed that God was calling us to Muncie. And we moved here in 2008. So just almost 9 years now that we've been here in Muncie. So that's what brought me to Muncie. That's how I ended up transplanting from Georgia to the Midwest, and out of Southern Baptist life into American Baptist life.
I'm assuming that's kind of atypical for somebody to do that.
Probably so, yeah. I think so. There's a few people in American Baptist life who came out of Southern Baptist life primarily because of Louisville's geographic location in terms of just being right across the river from Indiana. But American Baptist are the old Northern Baptist, and so most of the older congregations in the North are American Baptist, unless they've left and gone.
Where'd you do your undergraduate degree?
At Liberty University.
Oh, you did? Oh, okay.
Liberty, which is came out of my uncle was actually in a Christian school in Georgia, was a principal there, and that's how I ended up going to Liberty, and then came from there into Southern Baptist life, and then I recently attended Northern Seminary, which is an American Baptist seminary, doing a doctorate there. So kind of went the whole gamut of Baptist life.
Where is Northern?
Northern is in Lombard, Illinois.
Oh, that's right. There was a Chicago suburb.
Yep, Chicago suburb. Yep.
Yeah. What do you see as your main responsibilities here?
I think the pastor here in this congregation is really a shepherd to help the congregation really discern what God is doing and how God is moving, and helping the congregation respond to that. So just kind of like a shepherd may guide sheep and help them find direction. I think that's probably my main responsibility here. And I've learned, and as we'll probably talk about more, as being the only full-time staff person
Right.
here, I can't do everything. So
Yeah.
the congregation, I think in many ways, has learned to be the congregation, which is a very healthy dynamic. But my role is to guide them and to help them figure out what gifts they have, and then use those gifts to help the church to function.
How would you characterize the condition of your church right now?
I think it's in a healthy place. I think you might liken our congregation to maybe someone who is recovering from a disease, because the church had a lot of problems in the past,
Yeah.
primarily around the year 2005 or so. It was really a tumultuous time for this congregation, going through the worship wars.
Right.
Really brought the congregation to a low point in terms of attendance, in terms of financial resources, and so I think the church has healed in the last 8.5 years, and so I think we're in a very healthy place right now. Not perfect, and certainly still have problems at times, but
Right.
by and large, I think the congregation has healed much from where it was.
Has the membership fluctuated, say, a good deal, a little, in the last couple of decades?
Decades. Yeah, I think it's probably declined somewhat. It really hit a low point probably in about 2005. So probably a little over 10 years ago is when it was at a low point. If you back up another 10 years from there, it was probably a third larger
Okay.
than it is now.
Okay. What would that number be?
I think the church was probably up on an average attendance was probably about 250 or so, and now it's about now it's about 200. So, but in 2005 it was down to about 130. So it kind of took a dip,
Right.
and then it's beginning to grow a little bit now. Although the growth is not, it's fairly static over the last few years. Really, the people who are passing away or moving
Right,
into assisted
right.
living care facilities are
Right.
really being replaced by younger people. So
Okay.
it's almost we're not having more come in than are
Yeah.
leaving in that sense. But it's probably pretty static.
But you have been able, this is based on personal observation, having been here a few weeks ago, to have a good number of younger people in the congregation.
Yeah, it really, there's, when I came here, we have two different services.
Right.
An
We'll get to that in a minute.
Okay, that does help
Yeah.
help with the demographics of
Yeah,
the
okay.
congregation. When I came here, the transition had already taken place. There were two services when I
Right.
came, but the first service probably ran about 100 people on an average Sunday. That service is now running probably about 50 to 60.
And that's traditional?
Traditional.
Okay.
And the latter service, when I came, was running 30 to 50 people, and that service is running probably 125 on average.
Yeah.
So that service has grown. The first service has declined in terms of weekly attendance, mostly just because people have aged,
Yeah.
and have some have passed away, others have gone into assisted living facilities, so they can't
Yeah.
come to the church on
Well,
a weekly basis.
we're talking a little bit about this before we began our interview today, but as you go back in the history of traditional services versus contemporary services in mainline churches, when did this begin to change where churches of the mainline sort, whether it's here or anyplace else, decided we really need to try to serve two groups of people?
Yeah.
What was the real impetus for that?
Well, I remember I was at Central Baptist Church in Springfield.
Yeah.
It was very similar to First Baptist here in terms of demographics, in terms of a strong. The governor of Illinois was a member there for the 8 years prior to my coming. When I came in October, and he went out of office that following year. And the church had always been traditional in terms of worship style, and that was in '99. Probably around 2001, 2002, I remember having conversations, the leadership of that congregation, and beginning to talk about
Okay.
shifting. I don't know the year in memory, what year we switched at Central Baptist to contemporary worship, but I think that it was probably around 2003 or 4 here. It was probably the same there. That was one of the things when I came here. This church had such a similar journey to the church in Springfield. Same sort of dynamics. The church in Springfield changed worship service styles, lost many members when it did that, and the same thing happened here. Almost on. You can almost put the two churches side by side, and so I think conversations probably go back into the mid '90s. I began, in my experience, to see mainline churches beginning to make that shift right around 2000, and I guess that's when a lot of churches began to make that shift.
Well,
Would that be the same thing with your experience with?
Yeah, but I guess I want you to talk a bit about what's the impetus within a mainline congregation where we really have to do this.
I think we began to see churches in the mid '90s. Well, the mainline congregations have been declining since the '60s,
Right.
so it's not a new thing.
Right.
But I think there were many churches in the '80s and in the '90s that saw growth, and most of those churches were doing contemporary worship.
Oh, okay.
And so I think it's people in the mainline congregations looking at these other churches out there that many of them started doing contemporary. They church plants or whatever else, and younger people just tended to gravitate toward that.
Okay.
Mainline denominations began to grow older and losing young people. I think it's. I mean, if you look at the generation that are now in their 70s and 80s here in this congregation, very few of their children attend this congregation.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I think that there was kind of an exodus of that next generation.
Okay. What do you think the appeal is of the contemporary approach to worship?
I think that it probably ties in with how people are used to receiving information.
Okay.
And in our culture, I mean, think of the internet began in the early '90s.
Right.
I think there probably could be some study in terms of multimedia and contemporary worship. I wonder if those things go hand in hand. Music style.
Yeah.
I think people attention spans became less. Right.
All right. Well, I mean, I don't really know. I mean, it's. I had someone else tell me, and you're the first pastor I've had a chance to try this out on. They mentioned that the order of service of a contemporary service, where you have so much music at the front end of it, really appeals to a generation that goes to concerts. And I just wonder if you think there's any merit in that idea.
I think it may. You've attended our contemporary worship
Right,
here.
yeah.
It's not quite the level of a concert.
Right.
Now, I've been to churches
Right.
where
It is,
It
yeah.
is.
Yeah.
It's very much so. But I think by and large, our culture has become more casual. I mean, if businessmen who used to wear suit and ties to
Right,
work
right.
don't do that
No,
anymore. People who are professionals tend to be a little more casual. I think that's a dynamic of contemporary worship too. So not just the style of
Right.
music,
Yeah.
but the posture of the
Yeah.
church. There's also, I mean, we could talk about this for 2 hours probably, but there's also the dynamic of the distrust of authority. That's a part of it. And,
Sure.
and contemporary worship is more casual, more I'm sitting down and talking with you as opposed to preaching down to you.
Right.
There's a lot of different dynamics
Yeah.
that I think are reasons why contemporary worship appeals to the younger generation.
Well, in a mainline congregation like this, how much does doing that, having a traditional service and a contemporary service, create what I've come to call two congregations or two churches?
Yeah, I think that's very much the case in our church. We've talked, in fact, at Central Baptist, I'm friends with the person who's the pastor there now. They, long story, but they, a church on the outskirts of Springfield contacted them just before I left, almost 10 years ago now, and donated their building to them as that church died away, and said, we'd like for you to do a second site. They began to do that, and all that to say, just this year, that church has decided to do contemporary worship at that location, and they have merged their contemporary and their traditional service in their downtown location into one blended service.
Really?
Really, this just started this year.
Well, you better tell me about that, because that's the first time I've heard anybody come up with the idea of what is a blended service like?
Yeah, it leans toward contemporary, but it's not quite as loud.
Okay. No heavy bass.
I'm not sure. I've not attended it to know for sure. But they just started this in September. I actually talked to the pastor this week and asked, how are things going?
Yeah.
But the impetus of doing that was because there were two different congregations trying to bring that back. I don't think we're not ready for that.
Okay.
We do in many ways have two different congregations. We have to work pretty hard at creating opportunities for the two congregations to be together.
Yeah, we do too.
We do combined worship services probably 4 or 5 times a year.
Yeah.
I'm going on sabbatical this summer.
I know,
we
yeah.
may do a whole month of combined worship. So there'll be different opportunities to be together. But the value systems of our younger generation and our older generation are vastly different in terms of worship. And so as long as it's viable for us to continue to do traditional worship and contemporary worship, I think that the value of doing both and being able to provide places for both groups to worship is worth it, and it's a good thing.
Yeah. This is a digression, but I know you're doing this. What are you going to do on your sabbatical?
I'm going, we're going to go to the UK. We received a Lilly grant to do the sabbatical.
Right.
So I'm going to be there for almost 3 weeks. We're visiting churches there.
Okay.
Yeah, and resting and enjoying.
right.
But the overall theme of the sabbatical is to explore the effects of what is called post-Christendom. Have you heard of that word?
Yeah.
And it's happened in the UK many years before it's happened here.
Right.
So we're going to visit some churches there. We're going to come back. We're going to Georgia, where I'm from. We're going to vacation down there and also visit a church in Georgia, which at the south is a little bit not quite as far along
Right,
as the Midwest. And then my wife and I are going to spend 2 weeks in New England. And we're going to visit a few churches there, and so it's just kind of a.
Yeah.
But the theme is really to explore the effects of post-Christendom on our culture.
Is this a program? I know Lilly does a lot with supporting pastoral leaves and things
Yes.
like this. That's a program that you're doing. It's through the Lilly Foundation.
Clergy renewal program.
Right, yeah.
And the grant, the theme that I've chosen is something that we wrote up as a church.
Oh, okay.
That's not
Yeah.
prescribed by Lilly.
Right.
They let you do whatever you want,
Yeah.
but that's kind of what we're doing. At the same time, the church here will also take steps to explore the dynamics of post-Christendom in Muncie too. So
You want to define that for the people who are going to watch this,
Yeah.
post-Christendom?
it basically means that the church is no longer at the center of culture.
Right.
And that if Christendom can be defined really as Constantine becoming a Christian in the year 3 something,
Yeah.
and the church then being merged with the Roman Empire,
Right.
and the sociologists tell us that all the way from that year, all the way up until recent years, I don't think there's a defining year, but the church and culture have pretty much been together.
Right.
And it's been a popular thing to come to church. You didn't ask in the 50s
Right.
if you would go to church.
Right.
It was where you were going to go to church. And now that is no longer
And
the
that's
case.
been lost.
It's been lost.
Yeah.
And the scholars call it the death of Christendom. And so post-Christendom is
Right.
then what happens after that.
Yeah.
And in many ways, it's returning back to the time before Christians and culture were intertwined.
Yeah.
And Christians, in many ways, were opposed to culture,
Right.
or in contrast to
In the
culture.
earliest years of the church.
Earliest years of the
Yeah,
church.
yeah.
Yeah. So it's a different dynamic that we're living
Yeah.
in.
Yeah. Oh,
And,
definitely.
and so just trying to understand that and understanding before Christendom, there were no church buildings.
Right. Right.
And so what does that mean for us if we are
Yeah.
going into a world that is more like the year 100
Right.
as opposed to the year 1900?
Aside from membership as a major challenge that you and I think any pastor faces these days. What are the other challenges that face this particular church?
I think the church, in my mind, this church, if what we're talking about is true, if we're moving into a different sort of
Right.
world, many of the things that that this church was created to be no longer exist. The big building that we have,
Right.
the all the Sunday school rooms and
Yeah. Stained glass windows.
stained glass windows, all the things that are about the church. What do we do with that? Do we tear it down and say, well, we don't need this anymore, or is there a way to utilize the resources that we have, the rich history that we have, in a way that fits our culture? And one example would be, weddings.
Yeah.
I mean, people still want to get married in churches. I mean, not everybody, but
Yeah.
a lot of people do.
No, that's true.
So how can, there's some churches in town that you can't get married in that church unless
Right.
you're a member of that
Right.
church. And well, you're a member of this church, and so you have access to these facilities, and it's sort of a country club mentality. And I think shifting from this membership mentality to a mentality that is kind of like, we've been given this gift of a building. We have this long history as a congregation, and now how can we serve our community
Right.
rather than expecting our community to come to us?
Yeah.
It used to be you built a big church on the corner, and people came.
Yeah. Right.
As long as and then you worked really hard on doing all the things in the church right, so
yeah.
that people would come to you. And so I think the challenge is to say, well, that world doesn't exist anymore. What can we do with the resources we've been given to then go out into the community to impact our community in positive ways? And one way is give our building away when we can.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of the things that happen in our building are not things that we do. It's just simply an opening up our hands and saying, here, you can have this. We have Teamwork for Quality Living that has a weekly meal
Right.
in our basement. They utilize our kitchen, utilize our building. Battered Women's Shelter here in Muncie utilizes
Getting to my
it.
next question.
Yeah, I'm
No,
jumping
that's
ahead.
right. Well, no, but
Yeah.
but that's right, because I mean, the question, which bears on the point you're making, is what role do you see for the church in the wider Muncie community?
Well, I think that's just it. And this is the challenge, I think, as a congregation, that we move from this is ours for us
Right.
mentality to a mentality that says, what's God doing in our community, and now how can we participate with Him
Right.
in that? And
Yeah.
so the women's shelter meeting in our building on Monday nights, people wanting to get married, and then opening our building up and hosting them in a positive way. There may be other ways. We've and this may be where you're going with other questions, but we began to work with other churches in town on joint ventures,
Right.
and we've got to understand that we cannot do all that we need to do by ourselves
Right.
anymore. And I think that's really the effect of post-Christendom, is
Yeah.
that we have to begin to hold hands with other churches and say, how can we work together to do what God is calling us to do in our community? I think that, back to the previous question, the challenge
Right.
for us
Yeah.
is to begin to shift our mentality
Yeah.
so that we understand that we're not the church that we were in 1950 or 1960.
Right.
We have a different calling. We live in a different world. We have to discern our culture that we live in, and we have to ask the question, how can we be faithful in this
You
culture?
think that's generally accepted by the majority of your members?
I think so.
Okay.
I think the majority.
Yeah.
Now there are
Yeah,
a few
yeah.
that still have a different mindset.
Yeah. Well, I guess I was thinking of it more as, so an inner city church like this becomes more of a community center, and that it doesn't really have the strict denominational ties that it did at one point.
Yeah, and It's interesting. I serve as the president of our American Baptist Board, so I understand
Right.
the denomination.
Yeah.
And this change is happening on the denominational level.
Okay.
At least it is for us as American Baptist.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
At least it is for us as American Baptist. We're beginning to understand even the denominations are changing drastically.
Yeah.
Denominational used to be kind of the clearinghouse where they did all the materials and they passed it down to the different
Sure,
churches.
sure.
And if you were Presbyterian, you got everything from the Presbyterian denomination. If you were Baptist, everything came from the Baptist. The denominations don't exist like that anymore either. And so all of that is changing, and denominations are shifting now from being this top-down sort of entity to being an equipping entity to say, how can we help
Oh,
our
okay.
congregations
Yeah.
be what they need to be in
So
their
it's become more
communities?
democratic.
Yeah,
in
at
the
least
way
it
it's
is.
set
It
up.
always has been in Baptist life
Right,
on
yeah.
some level, but
Yeah.
but even more so than it used to be. So
Yeah.
that's beginning to shift and
Yeah.
beginning to change.
As you're well aware, in the last few decades, the community has experienced considerable economic and social change. In what ways have these economic downturns impacted this church?
Most of this happened before I came
Oh, okay.
to this church.
So you inherited it.
I inherited it,
Yeah.
but I'm certainly able to see
Yeah.
see the dynamics or how that's taking place. I think in general, I think as a church we have less resources than
Okay.
maybe we've had in the past.
Okay.
As I look back in time, you know, there were people of great resources who were members of this
Right,
church.
right.
There's scholarship foundations
Right,
here in Muncie
right.
that they're in the millions of dollars
Yeah, yeah.
that were donated, or the donors of those scholarship funds were members of this
Right,
church here.
right.
We still do receive sometimes large gifts
Mm-hmm.
from people who are wealthy, but that's not, and I think that used to be more so the case. And so our resources, I think, are less. People who come to our church now are not necessarily people of great means
Okay.
as they have been in the past in this church. And I think we have to learn how to do more with less because of
Okay.
that. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the staff of this
Yeah.
church at one point was 3 full-time pastors.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And now I'm the full-time pastor, and we
yeah.
have 2 part-time pastors here.
Well, have there been members of your congregation who have been impacted by these changes? I mean, we're not talking about specific names or anything like that, but if you think of members of your congregation, have these economic changes impacted?
I'm so sorry
That's
here.
okay. Have their lives? How have their lives been impacted by these changes?
Again, I think I didn't watch it happen. I wasn't here to watch it happen when
Right.
it happened. But I think that there are many in our congregation who are living in the grips of poverty now.
Okay.
I think Muncie is around 30%
Yeah.
mark
Yeah.
in terms of poverty. So we have people who come to our church
Yeah.
who are impacted
Okay.
by, in many cases, generational poverty.
Right. Right.
I think that in many ways, and I'm thinking of the older group that is beginning to pass away, people in their late 80s, early
Right.
90s.
Yeah.
I go and do their funerals,
Yeah.
and so I sit down with their family, and we have conversations about their life, and many of them worked in a factory, lived in one house sometimes
Yeah,
for
right.
50 years,
Yeah, that's right.
and their lives were certainly impacted by the economic downturn
Right.
in Muncie. They look to the
Yeah.
glory days of Muncie.
Yeah.
They, in many ways, still envision the prosperity of Muncie.
Yeah.
Many of their children have
Yeah.
left town.
Yeah.
And so that generation, that second generation, so you have people in their 80s and 90s, that generation of people in their 50s and 60s, many of them, most of them, are not in our congregation.
Right.
And many times it's because they left town.
Yeah.
And that may just be part of the dynamics of America today, but it also might be that Muncie has not been able to provide economically for that generation.
Oh, that's definitely the
So-
case. How is your church, you mentioned this a little bit, but I just want to get it in this category. How has your church been involved in the economic and social life of the community? I mean, you mentioned things like Teamwork for Quality Living. I mean, when you think of what goes on here in a given week, a given month, what sorts of things are really community oriented?
I think that's what we're working toward.
Okay.
I think that it's been. I don't think we are doing as good of a job as we need to be, and hopefully we will be doing in the next 5 years or 10 years from now. I think there are churches in our community doing a much better job at addressing the economic needs of the people in the community. I think we're trying to work as closely as we can with organizations who are doing that sort of work. Teamwork for Quality Living is probably our closest tie. Working with them, we have a long history with the Muncie Mission. I don't know if you know that this church is the founding, or this church is in the old church building is where the Muncie Mission started in the 30s, just across the street here.
Yeah, right.
And so the Muncie Mission has been very close. We still have members who are on the board at Muncie Mission, and we still do a weekly service there. So we work with different groups, but I think that most of what we do for the community is through these other organizations.
Okay.
We're not creating,
Right.
and which I don't think that it's our job to create those ministries as much as it is to find out who's already doing those ministries and go help them do it.
Well, I'm assuming that you would be really cognizant of this because of where the church is. I mean, as I said, you're the first inner city urban pastor I've talked to in this study. And I think when you think of these old, beautiful, traditional church buildings in downtown Muncie, the old traditional mainline churches, I guess I wonder how much the congregation and the pastor feel that they really have a commitment to try to do things that are more urban oriented.
Yeah, we definitely feel that, and we want to participate more in that. Open Door is just,
Right.
I mean, if you look at our neighborhood,
Yeah, right.
I mean, we're right in the middle of this.
You are, yeah.
So forming relationships with the YWCA,
Yeah.
we do have groups within our church who do ministry there. We have a group of women that go over and do makeovers for women at the Y. We work with Open Door whenever we have the chance.
Right.
They use our shelter here
Yeah.
for a lot of their food giveaways.
Okay.
We've tried to build a relationship with them and really just try to help them where we can.
Okay.
So we're very cognizant that
Right.
that we are in a neighborhood that where people are struggling.
Right.
We serve this summer. We were one of the sites for the summer lunch program. We did not have success.
Right.
That we did not have enough kids show up here, but we geared up for that. We had volunteers ready to serve in that capacity. So I think we're moving toward that as a congregation, but it is it's a different definition for church
Yeah, it
than
is.
than most of our older people have understood church to be. Now the younger people who are coming in, I think are coming in because of that. Many of the younger people who come to our congregation come because they have a sense of social justice.
Yeah.
And they could go to a church out in their neighborhood or closer to where they live, but they drive into downtown because they want to be a part of a congregation who's helping the community.
Is it fair to say that even with the size of your congregation, that you're always looking for ways in which you can have some impact on the community?
That's right.
Okay.
And it's been more of a process of discerning for us and just being open to that.
Right.
And then when those opportunities come our way, we respond to that as
Okay.
opposed to going and creating those opportunities.
Yeah. Those are one of my inner city questions. I pull into the parking lot here, I walk around your building, and I notice all the doors are locked. Or why is that?
Certainly, just because during the daytime we don't have people floating around the building. I guess I'll tell you a story.
Yeah.
Christmas Eve service, and we're sitting in here. It's packed out, not an empty seat in the building.
Yeah.
Everybody's here, 7 o'clock on Christmas Eve, and we're having a candlelight service. And I get up to preach on Christmas Eve, and there's a man sitting in just about the seat where I am right now, starts yelling,
Okay.
top of his voice, and he was on drugs,
Yeah, right.
and we had to have a few guys come over and took him to the door here, and didn't kick him out on the street,
Right,
just took him
right.
outside and said, we really need to be respectful in the worship service. They began to talk to him. He began crying, talking about his
Yeah.
father had passed away.
Yeah.
He was obviously intoxicated.
Yeah.
They prayed with him,
Yeah.
and he left and went on his way.
Yeah.
But that's part of being a downtown
It is.
church, and I think everybody who's here understood that. Nobody was upset by it. It's just part of the dynamic. Almost weekly, we have someone who
Sure.
comes asking for assistance.
Right. Right.
And we now do most of our assistance through Christian Ministries. We partner with them, and we
Right.
give them money, and so they can distribute it for us.
Yeah.
So we don't pass it out every week here.
Right.
But that's a dynamic that
Yeah.
is just a downtown church.
Well, I asked you the question because I live in the borough of Queens in New York City, where my father's church was. I went through the time when all the doors to this very large Dutch Reformed church were open, to a point where about the time I went out to college, they were all locked,
Yeah.
just because of the change in the community.
Well, we had this is again before my time,
Yeah.
but I think the church purchased an alarm system
Oh, okay.
in the mid '80s, and it happened because a secretary was in the building here, and someone walked into the building and threatened her during the middle of the day,
Yeah.
and that was, from what I'm told, the time when
That was, yeah.
they purchased an alarm system, and probably about the time they began locking doors during the week.
Do you work with any other churches or organizations on any community programs?
We partner with, we've partnered with Bob Ball.
Mhm.
They just changed their name. I'm
Well, it
trying to
was
think of
Blood
the-
and Fire.
Blood and Fire, and now it's
Yeah.
is it Inside Out or
Oh, okay.
something like that. They've
Yeah.
changed their name.
Right.
We partnered with them in some of their food ministries that they
Mhm.
have. We partnered with Grace Episcopal.
Okay.
They did a summer day camp a few years ago with middle school kids,
Right.
and so we partnered with them and
Yeah.
did that. We've partnered in Vacation Bible School with the Lutheran Church on River Road.
Mhm.
I can't think of the name of that one.
Mhm.
Is it Trinity?
I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
Anyways,
We haven't refined our Lutherans yet. We're working on Lutherans.
we partnered with them. We have a very close relationship with the Revolution Church now,
Okay.
to the extent that they do all of their baptisms here in our building
Oh, okay.
on Sunday evenings, about every 3 months.
Right.
Their pastors have a key and an alarm code to our
Okay.
building, and so they utilize our building quite frequently.
Yeah.
They're women. They have a women's retreat here in February. They're also using our building in August.
Okay.
We serve as a ceremony site for a couple of the fraternities at Ball State.
Mhm.
Guys who have connections with our church have
Right,
called to
yeah.
ask us
Oh.
if they can use our
Oh.
building for the fraternity initiation ceremonies, and so we've
Yeah.
allowed them to do that here.
Didn't know that.
That's not a church.
That's different.
Yeah, that's not a church, but I think we try to
Yeah.
partner with whoever we can partner with. Revolution also meets in the Student Center at Ball State,
Right,
and there's
right.
been a couple of times when the Student Center has been unavailable,
Yeah,
and so
right.
they've joined us for worship.
Oh, okay.
And we've worshiped together, and then a few years ago we did a Reach Week where we did a series of over a period of 2 weeks. We did a series. I think we did 8 or 10 service projects, and Revolution worked with us and did us work side by side with us on all of those projects. So
Okay.
I think in a lot of ways we've
Yeah.
worked with other churches, and
I mean, the Revolution's been on campus for quite a while, and I wasn't even aware of it. I went to one of their services.
Yeah.
And perhaps you can tell me, because you, I'm sure, know far more about this than I do. What is the Revolution as an organization?
well, they are celebrating I think it's their 30th anniversary this year,
Yeah.
and they are almost a mission agency. All of their
Okay.
pastors raise their own support.
Okay.
So their pastors come in supported like a missionary might be.
Oh, okay.
And so I think there are 4, 5, 6 pastors. I'm not sure. They fluctuate.
Yeah.
And they meet in the student center
Yeah.
during the school year
Right.
on Sunday mornings for worship service. And then they have a small group of families who are not students who are connected with the ministry. And then they meet on Sunday evenings during the summer with that smaller group.
Oh.
They have house churches with students. So it's a loosely connected group, but I think I'm in a pastors group, prayer group, with
Right.
some of those pastors, and just
Yeah.
getting to know them and
Yeah.
just expressing to them, hey, if you ever need anything,
Yeah.
let me know.
They,
And
they don't have any denominational affiliation, do they?
no,
Oh, okay.
it's a mission agency
Okay.
that they're closely affiliated with that has other campus-based churches throughout the country, and they're connected with that.
Okay.
It's more of a campus ministry than it is a church, but they are a church.
You mentioned during a conversation we had before our interview that you're part of a group of pastors who get together. You want to say a little bit about that as far as cooperation?
Yeah, the number varies, but anywhere from 5 to 15 pastors once a month gather, and we don't debate theology. we simply pray for each other, and we agreed to do that. When we first time we met, we thought, what are we going to do with this group?
Yeah.
And we decided right off the bat, we have differences theologically, and we could probably go around and around about this every week or every month that we meet.
Yeah.
And we thought we really don't need to do that. We just really need to pray for each other. So one pastor will share a prayer request with the person sitting beside them, and that person will pray for them. And we just go around the room and do that for about an hour. We do it once a month. And through that group, I've been able to form friendships with those pastors, which have led to
Right.
working together.
What role, if any, do you see for churches as part of what I'd call cultivating a sense of citizenship among their members? Do you think that's an important thing for a pastor to do in a congregation?
Citizenship in the community or citizenship of the
I
church?
I think it's more citizenship in the community.
Okay. I think that we're doing a program this summer. It's a national program. While I'm gone, the church is
Right.
going through this
Yeah.
program, and it's called Joining God in the Neighborhood.
Okay.
And it assumes theologically that God is already at work outside of the church,
Okay.
not inside the church, outside the church. And our job as Christians is to figure out what God's doing and to join Him in that. So I think that if you think in terms of citizenship in the community, from a theological standpoint,
Right.
if God is present and active in our community, citizenship in terms of in the city government,
Right,
in the school
right,
systems,
right.
in places of employment, if God is already there,
Right.
our role as Christians in those places is to just be attentive to what God's doing and just be present there. So I think our faith does impact.
Yeah.
And I think being a Christian is not as much what happens on Sunday morning as it is what happens the rest of the week. And so I think as we live out our faith, whether that's being ready to have a conversation with someone who's going through a difficult time. And there's an author that I uses the phrase, and I like this phrase, tending to God's presence.
Okay.
I like that
Yeah.
that thought of thinking that we would be tending to God's presence. So as Christians, our role is to be aware of where God is and what God is doing, and then just be present and active there. So I think is that what you're asking?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess what I'm really trying to get at is, do you, in the pulpit, as a spiritual leader of this congregation, see a connection between faith and being a good citizen of the community?
Of the community,
Yeah.
yeah. And yeah, I think if you look at it that way, and you think in terms of of a Christian who's sitting in a pew,
Right.
being a good citizen, and I guess you define that as being attentive to the needs of the community,
I do.
right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
You define that as being thoughtful of others,
Yeah.
you know, sensitive to what might need to be improved in our community. All of those things. I think the answer is yes. I would translate it as the citizenship in the community really is God already moving and working in the community. And for us to join him in that
Right.
is to understand our role as doing all that we can to, not doing it just for the good of the community, but as a Christian, understanding that we're empowered by God to be active where in the community because God cares about our community.
Yeah.
So that's how I would think about it.
Well, I guess, you're in the pulpit, whether it's a praise service, contemporary service, or traditional, and you'd be comfortable preaching that message.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, very much so. And every week, when we conclude our service, the prayer is called a sending prayer. And I say in one way or another every week,
Right.
now, okay, we gather for worship,
Right.
but now our interaction with God doesn't stop here. We now
Right.
go into our community.
Yeah.
So God, help us to be
Yeah.
the people that we need to be in our community, to be
Yeah.
the neighbors we need to be the coworkers that we need to be the family members that we need to
Right.
be, all of those sorts of things. So yeah, there's a direct impact with what we do here. And so it does change the way you think about church as
Yeah.
being something that
Yeah.
we come to as opposed to an equipping center for the rest of our work, which is
Yeah.
really our real work
Yeah, that's right.
of being a Christian.
Yeah, the real work isn't here.
The real work isn't here. The real work is
out
there. We
Yeah.
come here to
Yeah.
be equipped and to be empowered to hear the reality that God is working in our world, but really the next day when Bob shows up
Yeah.
in the office, that's when it really matters.
Yeah, it's one of sort of nurturing your faith commitment
Hmm.
and taking it outside of the sanctuary.
Yeah.
Well, those are the only formal questions I have. I want to give you an opportunity to add anything that you might wish to our interview, whatever
Well,
occurs to you.
I'm a pastor. I could talk all day. I mean, that's how.
That's why I like the practice. I knew this going in.
Yeah, pastors. I mean, you probably don't get short interviews, do you?
No, I said I got lots of articulate people I could talk to.
Yeah. I mean, I think that in 50 years from now, we'll look back on these days as days of transition. I think historians will, at least in terms of a religious perspective, when they look at the shift in churches and how churches function, the religious life of America, as they study that 50 years from now, I think they're going to call this something. I don't know what they're going to call it, but they're going to see a shift.
Yeah.
And I think we're in the middle of it now.
Yeah.
We're probably 10 to 15, maybe 20 years into it. So you really, being that close to it, I don't think you can fully understand it.
Yeah.
But I think we're trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
And I think that's our role. It's interesting. I was meeting with the president of a seminary last week and his staff, and we're talking about doing this as a region board person for our denomination.
Yeah.
And they were talking about their changes in curriculum for pastors.
Oh.
And they're teaching pastors ethnography. Is that the word?
Ethnography.
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 Yes.
Yeah.
And they're saying
Yeah.
that's essential
Yeah, it is.
that a pastor learn that. Now, I don't think 50 years ago they
Would
taught
have been
that.
true with my father.
Do what?
No, I mean, when I think of my father's denomination, getting out of seminary and during
Yeah.
the Depression.
Yeah.
They wouldn't have, I mean, he was aware of it because some of his summer work was in Hell's Kitchen in New York City.
Yeah.
But it wasn't something that was part of the curricular structure
No.
at New Brunswick Theological.
Yeah.
You're right.
And so this seminary is based in Chicago. So
Yeah.
they're taking their students into these inner city
Yep.
parts of Chicago.
Yep.
and they're teaching them how to understand cultural dynamics, and they're saying to their students, okay, whether God calls you to inner city Chicago or a cornfield in Indiana or wherever, you have to understand the dynamics of culture, and then you got to respond to that.
Yeah.
I think that's a different skill set
It is.
that pastors are going to have. I
No
think it used to be, even when I was in seminary in the early 90s, you were taught to preach, you were taught to conduct Christian education.
Preach and teach.
Preach and teach, conduct Christian education.
Yeah.
You were taught to manage the programs of the church, and it was it was just assumed people were going to come to church.
Right. Yeah.
And it's not the case
that's right.
anymore. So I think churches will change drastically.
Yeah.
In my role as a pastor of an established congregation that lived in the old world, is to help them make that transition. And I don't think it's a short transition.
No, I think you're right.
It's going to take time.
Since you've studied this a good deal, I'll ask you this question. What do you think? This is off the particular the specific subject, but what do you think the appeal of the mega churches is?
Anonymity.
Oh, okay.
I think there are some people who grew up in church, maybe value worship on some level,
Okay.
but I think that sometimes people really don't want to get too involved. We live in a world today of closed garage doors, and where people
No more front porches.
No more front porches. I think the mega churches will be around a while because I think that dynamic and culture is there. I think there's a new birth of a different kind of front porch church, if you will.
Yeah.
But I think that some people want to not be known. They want to come sit in a pew or probably a theater seat, not a pew, for a few hours on Sunday morning and consider a star on the board for them, and that's it. I mean, mega churches are certainly growing, and multiple campuses are very popular where the pastor isn't even there. There's a video screen, and he's in another city sometimes. So I can't quite understand attending a church like that, but there are lots of people who do. And there is some value, I think. I mean, they're understanding the Bible a little better, but it's hard to imagine how that pastor could speak to the needs of that community. Sometimes in a different state.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for participating in our project. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Ward.
Very kind.